I'm now recording, and that is a huge relief to me. Can everybody turn their cameras off, please, apart from Dinesh and Eva at this point. Thank you. Welcome to the British Animal Studies Network, and welcome back to some of the old friends I can see waiting and lurking in the corners of the participants. It's fantastic to see so many of you here today. And for those who are new to the British Animal Studies Network, just a very brief history before we start on the talks. The British Animal Studies Network was formed in 2007 when I organised a series of 10 events taking place in London on Saturday afternoons across 2 years. This ended with the lecture by Donna Haraway. It was then reformed in 2012 when I joined University of Strathclyde, and our first meeting up here was opened by Tim Ingold. Since then we've had 2 meetings a year, except for 2020 when unfortunately we only had 1 meeting, which was at Keble, Oxford, organised online thanks to Beth Greenoff and her colleagues there. The aim of the British Animal Studies Network was and is to provide a space for people working in the field of human animal studies from different disciplines to meet, to engage with each other. And this has, I think, become particularly important as the field has expanded. It would, I think, for all of us be very easy for us all to be going to conference after conference after conference in our own area. And not see the geographers, the sociologists, the theatre practitioners and so on. I think it's really important to think across disciplines, to think between disciplines, among disciplines in animal studies. And that is what I hope we will continue to be able to do with the British Animal Studies Network. I hope also, of course, that we will meet face to face at some point very, very soon. Today, we're delighted to welcome you to the first session in the British Animal Studies Network's violence sequence. This should have taken place on the 24th and 25th of April last year, but had to be postponed. We then rescheduled it to happen live face-to-face on the 16th and 17th of April this year, but COVID and Westminster governments being what they are, that is not happening, and we find ourselves here instead. I'm extremely grateful to the original lineup of panellists that they have all been able to stay with us, and they will be joining us for this sequence of one-off events that are taking place across April and May, and that our poet in residence, Susan Richardson, will be joining us for the final violence event in June. All the details can be found on our website. I'm extremely pleased then that we are able to begin the sequence of events today with Dinesh Wadiwel and Eva Haifa Giraud. Eva is an old friend of the network and of the Animal Studies gang at Strathclyde. In fact, she was the last non-Glasgow person I saw in the flesh before all of this happened, when she came to give a paper at Strathclyde and then to join me and colleagues on the picket line the first day of the UCU strike before heading back down south. Today, Eva and Dinesh are going to be in conversation about their work, the place of violence in that work. And all that's left for me to do now is to introduce them before I hand over. I'll keep this brief because I'm sure you all know these people. Dinesh is Senior Lecturer in Human Rights and Socio-Legal Studies and Department Chair of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Sydney. He came to academia following 15 years experience working in the non-government sector. Between 2002 and 2007, he was employed as a Senior Policy Officer at the Council of Social Service of New South Wales. He has significant experience within the disability right movement and was a previous executive officer of National Ethnic Disability Alliance, the national organisation representing people from non-English speaking backgrounds with disability. His publications include The War Against Animals, Brill 2015, Animals in the Anthropocene, Critical Perspectives on Non-Human Futures, Sydney University Press 2015, which was as part of the Human Animal Research Network editorial collective at the University of Sydney, and co-editor with Matthew Trulou of Foucault and Animals, Brill 2016. His essay Biopolitics appeared in Laurie Gruen's Critical Terms for Animal Studies in 2018, and he's currently working on a project on the relationship between animals and capitalism. Eva Haifa is Senior Lecturer in Media, Culture and Creative Practice at the University of Kiel, where she's also the Programme Director of Media. Her book, What Comes After Entanglement, Activism, Anthropocentrism and an Ethics of Exclusion, was published by Duke University Press in 2019. She's also published work on hate speech, Haraway and animal rights activism, anti-capitalist food activism in journals including Theory, Culture and Society, Social Studies of Science, Convergence, Feminist Review, and the Sociological Review. Her next book, Veganism, Politics, Practice and Theory, is in the Bloomsbury series Contemporary Food Studies and will be published later this year. I am going to stop speaking now, and I'm going to pin Dinesh and Eva so that they can take it over from here. So Eva, I'm looking for you and you've vanished. Where are you?
I'm here. Can you hear me? See me?
I can't see you for some bizarre reason. Right, I'm going to
find. Anyone see me? A couple of people can see me. Dinesh can see me.
Go, you keep going.
I said they can see me, so. Okay.
I'll hand over to you, Eva.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, firstly, to echo Erica, thank you all so much for coming. It's a really obviously fantastic number of people, and I actually feel quite emotional because I can see some friends and people I know who I last saw before the lockdown. So yeah, it's really great. Although obviously today some of the things that we're going to talk about are, I suppose, probably quite difficult questions and issues we've been grappling with in our work. And I kind of wanted to open things by asking, I suppose, a deceptively simple sounding question, but one I think is quite difficult in practice to address to Dinesh. When we're thinking about how we define concepts of violence, how do we even go about doing that? How do we kind of develop working definitions of violence to use in our work?
Thanks so much, Eva. Can I just start by saying what a pleasure it is to be part of this, and so great to see so many friends I haven't seen for such a long time. I hope everyone's keeping safe and well in these very strange times. I'm coming from Sydney, and I just want to acknowledge I'm on settler colonial land. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. So I just wanted to acknowledge that reality of stolen sovereignty. I think this is actually a really hard question, trying to define what violence is. And I have to say, I don't think there are fantastic definitions out there. And the reality of politics and the way that social movements that try and deal with violence, the way they grapple with it, reveals that we don't have a consistent understanding about what violence actually is. And this is because it's actually quite variable, and we'll get to that, I think. I thought I'd start with the OED definition, because I think actually it's revealing. So this is what I just looked this up today. So the OED says violence is, quote, the exercise of physical force so as to inflict injury on or cause damage to persons or property, end quote. Now, what I think is interesting about the definition is we could split it into two halves, the OED definition. The first half says these are the means of violence, i.e. the exercise of physical force. And the second half is about the effects. So it causes injury or damage to persons or property. I think this definition is faulty because it doesn't actually doesn't get to the heart of what violence is. So maybe to start with the first part, the means of violence. So the OED seems to assume that the means of violence tells us something about violence. So if it's a fist or a knife or a gun being used, then this equals violence. And often we associate violence with the means or the mechanisms used to achieve violence. But when I say fist, knife, gun, all of these are means to achieve violence, but not necessarily violence itself. So that I think is interesting, that that's one problem, is that we often confuse the means of violence with violence itself. The other side is we often think about the effects of violence. So violence as causing injury or damage or discomfort or harm in some way. And often this is the usual metric for measuring whether violence actually has occurred. But again, this is about the effect of violence, but not violence itself. And I think, again, to go back to that OED definition, what I find striking about it is it doesn't seem to get us to the heart of violence. It merely describes the means of violence or the effect of violence. The reason why I think we often talk about the means and effects of violence are that these are the objective or maybe empirically measurable ways that we can understand that violence has actually occurred. So we look at, we pay attention to guns or bombs or fists or various mechanisms of violence. Alternatively, we pay attention to the harm that is caused, and often legal redress or justice might follow rectification of the harms caused by violence. But I think what that misses is the subjective dimension of violence. And that's actually the hard thing, is that violence makes the most sense to those who experience violence. And they're the ones that are most likely to be able to attest to the reality of violence actually taking place. And in a way, we know this, I think, because of the way that the politics of social movements that try to contest violence, the way that those play out. So if we think about the attempts by feminist movements to problematize sexual and domestic violence, typically they strongly relied upon highlighting the subjective element of this violence. So feminist movements typically faced a dominant patriarchal discourse that treated this violence, or continues to treat this violence, as just not happening. So in the case of domestic violence, treated as that, well, this is just something that happens in the family, or sexual violence as somehow trivial or not worthy of any kind of political focus. So the action of social movements, like feminist social movements, have been precisely to problematize gender-based violence and what this means for different bodies and beings in that story. And to me, this indicates something about the kind of dynamic of violence itself, that it isn't just simply about looking at various means that we think might give us a clue that violence is happening, nor simply looking at particular effects and saying, well, if those effects aren't happening, the violence isn't happening. It has to involve something that's subjective. Now, I think obviously this immediately poses some challenges for thinking about animals, which we'll get back to in a moment. I'll also say that central to this is, and this also relates to how we might think about violence against animals, central to this subjective dimension of violence is the centrality of consent. So consent in a way becomes a gateway to understanding of violence happens. So often violence is, we understand subjectively violence is happening when consent fails or when consent withers. And I think that to me is also part of this story, why the subjective element remains important. I'll also just flag a different aspect of all of this, which is that violence is in many ways relational in nature. And it's kind of odd to say relational in the sense that, and certainly for animal studies, I think this for people here, you'd understand that and I know you get this, Eva, too, because of your book, that lots of the work that's happening in, say, animal studies or posthumanism or new materialisms have tried to emphasize relationality and complexity and entanglement. And they've often done so to say that relations are often complex and codependent and therefore never one way. Now, one of the challenges we have is that I think that violence is quite a unique example of a relation. So obviously it has to rely upon a person who is violated, and individuals or institutions or social practices that create a situation of violence or violation. So there's always a relation, but it's unique in that the reciprocity of the usual relations that we would understand relational practices, that reciprocity completely disappears. So in a way, it's almost like reciprocity and consent literally are sucked out of this relation. So if we're going to maybe phenomenologically understand violence or the experience of violence, it is this feeling that all possibility of reciprocity or even escape disappears. So the experience of being violated is irrefusability, the fact that I cannot escape this particular relation that has been imposed upon me. And again, if you've had a personal experience of violence, which unfortunately many people have, this is precisely the feeling. It is the feeling of being stuck, of irrefusability. It's not a feeling of not relation. It is actually a relation, but it's a relation that refuses any reciprocity. So to me, this is, I think this, for me, helps us kind of unpack what is going on with violence as a phenomenological relation. And it's quite a curious one. It's one that I think in some ways refuses relationality, but also cannot be defined purely by focusing on the means that we use to achieve violence, nor the effects of the violence in the form of harm. It has to understand all of that together.
I think that's an incredibly rich articulation of the issue at stake, and that idea of inescapability in particular is something that I think might be quite important to come back to. But one of the things that I kind of just wanted to, I suppose, revisit was something you said earlier when you kind of said this can be quite difficult to think about in the context of animal studies, perhaps due to the heterogeneity of the field and perhaps due to differences in terms of how violence is understood by those with different commitments in animal studies. So I wanted to kind of, I suppose, ask a question really. And the first part is, in a broad sense, what do you think some of the kind of challenges are of engaging with frameworks of understanding violence in the context of animals in a broad sense? And then relatedly, what do you think the specific challenges are within animal studies as a kind of academic discipline? So violence more general and violence in the context of animal studies.
Yeah, look, thank you. That's a great question. I think, so there's the numerous challenges for thinking about animals as subjects of violence generally. Many of these are, I would say, epistemic challenges. So in my book, The War Against Animals, I use the phrase epistemic violence, which is a phrase that I've taken specifically from post-colonial and post-colonial feminist theory. So from scholars such as Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak. And these scholars tried to, in a way, make sense of the way that the experience of colonialism was an experience which wasn't just about the use of systematic forms of, say, physical violence and theft of land, theft of resources, use of violence to control and dominate, but also the imposition of knowledge systems that remove the possibility for the subject of violence to speak about their situation, except in the terms of the colonizer. Now, I think for me, this provided a really rich way to understand some of the problematics we have that relate to hierarchical anthropocentrism, in the sense that what anthropocentrism could do, or some forms of anthropocentrism could do, is seek to completely replace or narrate the world of animals as we see them in a way that continually frames animals as inferior or lacking particular intelligence or qualities. So none of this I'm saying is particularly radical to anybody here. But I think when it comes to the question of violence, one of the pernicious effects of this, for me, is that animals appear as not being able to experience violence. So they're not able to be violated, or not able to be subjects of violence, in the sense that we can recognize this violence and make sense of it. So there's some different ways that we could think about this, and one is that we know the reality of much visible violence against animals is that we experience it through a systematic institutional form of sequestration. So if we think about food production or animals used in research labs, this largely happens out of sight, and obviously many scholars have looked at this. So in a sense, one way to think about this is that our knowledge systems are constrained because animals are hidden from sight. But the more complex problem for me is that there are many examples where we expose animals to violence, sometimes en masse, and we just don't see it. So in terms of mainstream culture, we just don't see it. And so maybe, I mean, one example would be horse racing, where many forms of horse racing, there's now much documented evidence that this is completely at odds with just basic welfare. But the spectator doesn't necessarily see this violence, even though it's in front of them. But maybe a different example that a few years ago, I wrote a paper on recreational fishing practices in Australia. So obviously around the world, many people fish for subsistence purposes, and many communities rely on fish for food. But there's also a significant portion of fishing that happens, or small-scale fishing that happens globally, that is recreational in nature, which really can be defined as fishing for fun. In Australia, Australia has a strong industry around fishing for fun, recreational fishing, and very high rates of participation. So something like 25% of Australians participate regularly in fishing. When you look at the data at who does this, we find very high participation rates for both men and women, which is striking because often we have a narrative that this form of hunting, and that's what recreational fishing is largely a kind of masculine patriarchal practice. So it's interesting to see this sort of data, but also in Australia, we see very high rates of participation from children. So in states such as Western Australia, it's up to 40% of children engaging regularly in recreational fishing. What interests me about it is that this reveals in a way something that's quite disorienting, that large numbers of people are actively involved in watching animals being dragged out of the water, experiencing visible suffering and resistance. But this is not politicizing. So the vision is not politicizing. In fact, this is not seen as violence as such. So to me, this is an epistemic problem. It's a problem in knowledge systems that requires a different level of politics, because we can't just simply tell people, oh, that's violent. we need to actually work on the knowledge systems to create the capacity for people to be able to speak about violence. Now, again, I don't think this is a new problem. So the problem that, let's say, animal welfare or animal rights groups are facing in terms of addressing the epistemic dimension is not, to me, a problem that's dissimilar from what other social movements have faced. So again, going back to the politics of feminist movements around sexual and domestic violence, these feminist movements typically had to counter patriarchal ideas that assumed that women could not experience violence in the ways that women said they were being violated. So this actually involved epistemic work as part of the social movement. So to literally say, what is happening there, that is violence, or that is sexual assault, or that is rape. So that, in a sense, becomes part of the repertoire of the social movements to actually do this epistemic work. But I think for animals, there's something quite striking about having to do that work. I know I've sort of talked a long time, but I have one more thing to say about all of this, and that's the problem around language, right? So animals can't directly use human language to tell us what they're experiencing. This isn't, by the way, a problem that is insurmountable. So as we've just talked about, the problem of all epistemic violence is that it silences the victims of that violence. So in a sense, this shouldn't be necessarily an obstacle, but obviously it creates one layer of problems for how we actually understand whether violence is happening. So a critic might just say, well, animals haven't told us that they're suffering, so, or they're experiencing violence, so therefore they're not. But I think central to my work has been to try and understand the ways in which animals reveal their non-compliance or resistance to our attempts to subordinate them. So a lot of my work has been really focused on looking at the kind of everyday technologies that are used against animals within large-scale industrial systems, and pointing out that by design, some of these systems or technologies quite literally aim to quell the resistance of animals to our attempts to subordinate them. So maybe to just give you two quick examples, and these relate to two different scales. So two examples from my work. One of the most simple, ingenious, and oldest technologies that we use against animals is the fish hook. So a fish hook is a remarkable and ingenious device. It allows its operator, through the use of a line, to ensnare an animal from a long way away. So a fish hook will ensnare the being on a lip, or unfortunately sometimes somewhere else. And as the fish struggles against the hook, this will ensnare them even more deeply, because as they struggle, they almost they make it worse for themselves. So in a sense, this ingenious device tells us something, that this animal does not want to be caught, and certainly does not want to remain on the hook. If they did want to be caught, then we wouldn't need the hook. And so the hook tells us something about the dynamics of resistance that shapes that relationship between the human and the fish in this particular instance. Maybe to give you a different example, and this is more of a macro scale example. In many chicken processing operations, at a certain point when it comes time to take chickens to slaughter, human workers are deployed to catch them in the large pens and stuff them into cages and then load them into trucks, and then they're taken to the slaughter facility. This work is typically quite dangerous. So the human workers who have to do this job of catching chickens, and these are chickens who quite literally do not want to be caught, will be scratched and bitten when they're trying to catch the chickens. They also face repetitive strain from actually having to bend down and constantly chase the chickens and stuff them into the crates. So recently there's been attempts to develop what are called chicken harvesting machines, which are increasingly used in large-scale poultry production. And these machines kind of look like big vacuum cleaners. They're horrific in my view. And the operator will just simply drive over chickens within a large space and suck them into the internality of the machine, and the machine will then stuff them into crates alive to be taken to slaughter. To me, this tells us something about resistance. It tells us that resistance by animals to subordination is always a cost to the system. And there are always attempts by human technical progress to try and overcome this resistance as a constant interplay. So this is a very different kind of relationality that I'm talking about. But what the analysis reveals to me is that animals reveal their own intentionality, their own response to violence through their resistance. And we respond by trying to quell that resistance. And we can track this history, if you like, in the development of the mechanisms we use to contain animals. So to me, that's a different route from the epistemic violence dimension, but it's one that allows us to give voice to animals in the face of violence because we're just paying attention to the realities of that dynamic.
Those histories can be a sort of incredibly powerful way of examining that kind of entanglement, really, of epistemic violence with certain practices that kind of underpin that violence. And I was just thinking of a kind of parallel example in some work that I did a while back with Greg Collin about laboratory beagles. And one of the reasons we did that work was after reading When Species Meet and really kind of having all this hopeful excitement about it and, you know, liking aspects of it. When it got to the section on laboratory beagles, the kind of of some of the relationships that were being talked about made me think, is there a way of understanding these relationships as anything other than violent and instrumental at heart? And just because animals aren't resisting in an overt sense doesn't mean that we can kind of ignore that instrumentality or those longer kind of histories of violence, because quite often various techniques, various infrastructures almost foreclose certain forms of resistance in advance. And I think those kind of histories that have foreclosed resistance need really to be brought to the surface. I think that history is incredibly important rather than just focusing on, I don't know, a sort of benign seeming encounter in a specific context. And when with lab beagles, you know, the initial designs of large-scale beagle colonies were all entangled with the Manhattan Project and, you know, these huge lifespan experiments where they gave beagles radioactive food, but were also experimenting with creating cage designs to make beagles less disruptive and more easy to handle in experiments. So you might look at a kind of beagle-human relationship today and think, oh, the beagle's not struggling, it doesn't look like a kind of violent relationship. But I think it's really important to think, well, what's been excluded in order for that convivial relationship to emerge in the present? And you can kind of then reread and rethink that relationship on the basis of reflecting on that history of exclusion. Sorry, that was
I guess, no, that's great, because I wanted to flip it a little bit and get you to talk a bit about your work, Eva, because you've written this fantastic book, which I think starts, like, it does this work that I think was much needed in the field to ask some of these more difficult questions about where things are going. And if I was going to again think about Haraway's When Species Meet, it was, I mean, on one hand, it's incredibly refreshing, justifiably groundbreaking book, because it set a new way to look at a whole range of different relations, and it paid attention to things that other scholars weren't paying attention to. But the flip side is that it remained to some extent silent, or chose to set aside some of these difficult questions around violence and exclusion. And there certainly has been a growth in scholarship that I think has done remarkable work in kind of unpacking the complexity of entanglements and relationality. But we haven't been able to get to a point where we weave in the stories around violence and domination, which has only been a frustration to me, because I guess I accept that all relations are complex, but we need to also give an account of the place of violence and domination in many human-animal relations. So I wanted, if it's okay, this is a bit cheeky, but I want to read just a section from your book. And this is it from the conclusion. See, I'm embarrassed. I hope I'm not embarrassing you. So this is from the conclusion of what comes after entanglement. And you make the argument that we need to understand the constitutive role of exclusion, which is not just a negation of something, but plays a necessary and creative role in the fabric of the world. And then you go on to say, it is essential not just to acknowledge the constitutive role of exclusion, though this is important, it is also vital to address the more fundamental implications of this recognition by actively politicizing exclusion. Exclusion is not just something that happens, an inevitable component of the ever-evolving entangled composition of the world, but is often bound up with particular socio-technical infrastructures and political decisions, end quote. So I guess I wanted you, I don't know whether you'd be happy to just talk a bit about, where do you think violence fits in, and what's some of the problems, what are the complexities in trying to raise the question around violence?
Oh, wow. It is very weird having someone read that out to me first. Okay. One of the things that was in part response to a tendency that I feel I'd been seeing with work that would mention things that were kind of horrendous, like relationships between humans and animals, where there were quite kind of violent deaths involved, or, you know, and then would frame those relationships as non-innocent. And I was talking to a couple of friends about this, and we sort of were saying that the term non-innocent, when being used to describe the sort of entangled relationality of the world and the acknowledgement that, you know, yes, some relations aren't good or not good, that's a bit normative, but some relationships are complex, and it's important to recognise the non-innocence of every relationship. There was a kind of sense that almost that was serving almost like the limitations of a methods section or something like that, where there was this kind of term thrown in, and it was a means of avoiding any normative judgment about which relations should be pushed for and potentially not others. And I think that that's sometimes the issue, and it's really hard, you know, because I think there's this real worry about taking a normative stance that's overly universalizing, and, you know, I think understandably that sort of stance has been problematized for all sorts of different reasons. But on the other hand, I feel that in situated contexts, sometimes this body of theory doesn't really give you anything to kind of grapple with, in terms of, it's great at acknowledging complexity, it's great at acknowledging the sort of irreducibility of particular relationships, but in terms of actually plotting a path through them, and the other thing that that's coupled with is that there's such a suspicion of critique, that any form of critique of the relationships that currently constitute certain human-animal relationships in the world are then kind of framed as, oh, well, that's overly totalizing, that's overly normative. And I think, yeah, that criticism can be made of specific forms of critique, but I really worry that critique in general is sometimes excluded out of hand for somehow not being complex enough, somehow not being nuanced enough. And actually, you know, there's so much really important critical work, such as your own, that actually gives you the tools to start engaging with these types of questions about the violence of particular forms of relations and how to think through and grapple with that. And I really worry that sometimes those types of critical engagements can almost be impossible if we're just focusing on narratives of entanglement and complexity. I think Carrie Hamilton has got a really nice line about that in her book on veganism, where she kind of says, look, there's all this fantastic work about food systems that really captures that everything is really complicated and everything needs to be situated. But, you know, how did we get to a stage where thinking about animals and the ethics of how particular people engage with animals is framed as lacking complexity and essentialist? You know, surely there's more to animal ethics than just being this kind of essentialist stance. Yes. I don't know whether to throw. Have you got anything?
You again?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, have you got anything you were thinking in relation to that question, or why did you ask that particular? Why did you pick that particular quote, and what were you interested in relation to?
I guess, I mean, so I guess one of the things I find interesting is the relationship between ethics and politics, and perhaps, and it's something that I think your book covers, and that quote covers that terrain, that we assume that they are necessarily the same thing, but I'm not clear that they are. So sometimes, and so lots of the field, for example, is engaging with a kind of new set of ontologies, and from this trying to define ethical relations or relations of responsibility that flow from new entangled and complex ontologies. So when we stop saying that animals are just simply objects and humans are subjects, and start recognizing sort of shared agency between complex networks of human and non-humans, what does ethics look like in that situation? So there's a lot of work that engages with that. But I don't think that gets to the heart of what politics is about, because the first project, the question about, say, ethics, is in some ways detached from the reality of a political situation, because politics is always partial. So almost every political solution or political aspiration isn't going to bring everybody along with you. And that's the nature of politics. Politics is partial and not agreeable in some respects. And I guess for me, I think that's, I mean, I'm personally not, someone might critique my book or my work and say, you're very normative. And I think it's true, I am. Like, I don't, you know, I have a normative view, but that's because I have a partial perspective on what I want to achieve with my work, which is I kind of want to make a world with reduced violence. That's what I want. So it's not just about non-humans, it's also about humans. And that will involve institutional practice, discourse, knowledge change that will disenfranchise some people. I think so that it's going to be a not satisfactory solution for everyone, i.e. it's political. And so I guess that's, and coming back to the centrality of subjectivity to how we define violence. Of course, say if we think about, I talked about feminist politics and feminist movements against domestic and sexual violence. The reality of these movements is that they disenfranchise privilege. They disenfranchise individuals who benefited from that violence. And that's partial, it's political, it's not going to be agreeable. And I don't know whether that's in the, there are elements around ethics and reciprocity that are important to think through, but I'm not clear that discussions around ethics or ontology flow cleanly to discussions around politics, because the latter is about urgent partial demands. I want this violence to stop now so I can survive. So I don't know whether that gels or not with you.
No, that's really helpful. And I think one of the things that I've sometimes worried about, and I know a few of the people I've spoken to have as well, is sometimes a sense that a kind of relational ontology can give rise to a sort of new forms of ethics that challenge certain forms of hierarchical anthropocentrism. And the question is that always the case? Is that necessarily the case? And if it's at the expense of other frameworks that do important political work, you know, we need to ask some really difficult questions, I think. One thing I just wanted to kind of go back to, because I know we need to probably round up this section of the talk shortly. I kind of got two really different questions, but I think I'm going to just focus on this one about the point that you made there about some of the dangers, I suppose, or not dangers, some of the consequences of labelling things violent that a lot of people might not think of as violent. And I think sometimes that's caused tensions in animal studies as an academic field, and sometimes it's caused tensions politically. And I just wanted to give a kind of example of that from a really great piece I read by Alex Lockwood that was talking about save campaigns, and the kind of that there were tactics involved in those campaigns that weren't just about commemorating sites of animal slaughter, but there were these attempts to share food and things with workers as well, but none of the workers ever really wanted to always take them up on the food sharing, which would have potentially created solidarity between maybe workers who are quite marginalized and activists. And I don't think that's a kind of unique case. I think there have been lots of attempts to try to bridge certain gaps between, you know, people who do certain forms of labour associated with agriculture and activists. But I think one of the real difficulties of grappling with this is, as soon as you kind of frame things as violent that normatively aren't seen as violent and are smoothed over as you put in the war against animals and framed as peaceable relations, that does all sorts of really important political work and vital political work. But it also kind of creates I suppose, a cut wherein groups of people are framed as perpetrators of violence who, it's not just don't see themselves in that way, society doesn't see themselves in that way, and they affectively maybe don't feel that way and maybe relate, you know. I think it's a really kind of complicated thing to unpick, I suppose. So I wondered if you could kind of speak to that in any way.
Yeah, I can try. And I think we're getting towards questions of strategy rather than empirical analysis. So at a level of empirical analysis, I might go away and write a book like The War Against Animals and decide, as I did, that probably most human-animal relations involve some form of violence and domination. But that doesn't necessarily mean that as a political strategy, we would use that word in the same way in trying to engage with different social movements that are trying to make change. And that's more of a question of political strategy, because the word means something that ends up, as you pointed out, being divisive. And maybe to give you an example, Erica mentioned that I had a background in doing disability rights work in Australia. And quite recently, I'd been working with a group of disability organisations around the application of the Torture Convention to the treatment of people with disability, largely in institutional contexts. Now, the use of the word torture, so torture as a human rights word has a high value in that it mobilizes individuals because of the gravity around torture and its implications. But whether disability advocates should use the word torture in all circumstances actually is an open and vexed question, because torture is forbidden under international law, and it means that no government will ever agree that they are torturing people if you challenge them on this. So if advocates go to the government and say, you're torturing people, stop, the response of the government will be, we don't torture anybody, right? And actually governments around the world just say this constantly. So in a sense, there's a limit to how useful the word can be. It's useful in certain contexts, so raising public awareness and understanding particular practices of violence as constituting torture can help mobilize social movements, but it also can close doors if you're trying to manage or build alliances to make change. And I think that's the case for the word violence. I think it's important for people to think about how you're using that word politically, and I don't know whether it's valuable for advocates to be using the word in all political circumstances where you're trying to negotiate change. That said, I think there's some things that we should be thinking about, including who the perpetrator of violence is when we're thinking about, say, industrial food systems. To me, there's lots of scope for us to be thinking together with human workforces that face unbelievably exploitative and dangerous conditions producing animal-based foods, to be thinking about the system itself as violent, but the workers them individually as not necessarily directly complicit in this violence. That doesn't mean, of course, these workers on a day-to-day basis are involved in the business of containing, harming and killing animals, but understanding that the site of violence or the responsibility for that violence sits elsewhere potentially helps us to make the kind of alliances that I think we need to make. And certainly I'd agree, our vision about this, I agree with Alex's work in terms of trying to build solidarity. I think Alex is on this Zoom call, which is great. Hope it's true. In building solidarity with the workforce, to me, this actually is, in my view, a fundamental strategy that animal rights or animal welfare movements have to engage with, which is building solidarity with the labour forces within animal agriculture.
Things scribbled down on my piece of paper, but I think Erica kind of did sort of yeah, I think we've probably gone slightly over the length of time we were supposed to do the discussion.
No surprise.
No. So I think probably Erica, is it?
I just want to say thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic, and the overrunning was not an issue at all. So I've just stopped